Hello everyone, today just a brief reflection on the innovations in Napoleonic tactics and rather the doctrinal debate revolving around the necessity of essentially returning to denser and deeper formations. I already made a video titled The Grande Querelle that illustrates how after the 7 Years' War especially the French Royal Army underwent like sort of an interesting reconsideration, not just because of the lost war essentially, but because of the increasing also necessities of reform, right? And still some old tactical, let's say, discussions that had started presenting with the possibility of a return to the column as a mean of course, of attack. That essentially linear tactics at this point in history, so we're talking towards, let's say, the French Revolution, had in Europe settled on the basis of essentially Frederick the Great intuition, except for France that had an important, to say the least, military tradition on its own that in these years, the 70s especially, of the 18th century had been exemplified by the work of the Guibert that would keep influencing also, in fact, Napoleonic military thinking. And that was not even the first to have brought up again in a more, say, comprehensive fashion, not much the necessity, but the proclivity to recur, at least more often than before, to the column. Linear tactic was unavoidably the art of war of the time. The line would not be superseded by the column, but the, of course, sort of advantages and disadvantages of both formations, especially in an age of mass warfare like the Napoleonic one we're starting to be, of course, would highlight the options, especially a more compact formation would offer, especially as armies were getting bigger. And this is not just because of the French Revolution that, of course, would sort of really introduce that by scale, obliging basically the other countries to do the same in Europe, but also because of the increasing potential that larger armies had even before that, and that had sort of not been fully understood even by in its full potential by Frederick the Great of Prussia. I made a video in which we observed how, of course, the Prussians relied, and Frederick was actually very convinced of this at the beginning, on cold steel to settle engagements for reasons that had to do with the particular pressure that Prussia had in terms of, let's say, tactical performance, because it was fighting against giants in the midst like of France, Austria, and Russia, and therefore, in order to survive, had to make this gigantic effort, which is reflected by Prussian hierarchy, discipline, order, and so on, down to the very battlefield, which basically the Prussian standard was maybe like always maintaining that order, that formation that wouldn't have to be broken even when, for example, under fire and having all the advantage actually breaking formation to close the gap, like to overwhelm like a weaker enemy, and that was becoming in that sense just like the hallmark of the Prussian standard. That because of this moral, let's say drive, would also recur to actual charges performed, of course, in that case, like it's different from the example I just made regarding the necessity of maintaining formation anyway, and this was not in an absolute sense possible even for the Prussian army entirely. But that had, of course, brought on the field essentially more combative troops, capable of solving matter with bayonet, fixed, and therefore proving in that sense the intrinsic moral superiority. Towards the end of his military career, Frederick, however, noticed that artillery was sort of gaining, say, pace, to say the least. There were some, of course, bloody, proofs that this had become the case, because the Prussians had relied on that kind of bayonet attacks, and it was noticed that without preliminary bombardments of very well, say, entrenched positions, the tactical result was not to always be the same. So of course there is all a progression that too. But Prussia was not France when it came to properly the scale of its military necessities. That's why the French were the guys who were beginning, so because of the availability of troops and the larger army, and in a certain sense the possibility of sacrificing even parts of them to in fact close that gap with the enemy and deploying troops, say, closer to it, and requiring the column for the obvious advantage that speed, like maneuverability, it affords, paying in the lack of temporary firepower before at least the unit is deploying to a line, were tying the most with that idea. And in, let's say, in the French regulations and theories and treatises, debates, etc., the importance of the column was sort of being revived as the seeds of what eventually the French potential as far as the revolution, like the extension of rights, at least the fact of including the duties, of course, of being conscripted for the broader purpose that the revolution was bringing out there, including fighting basically with all the rest of Europe. It's always a munus, a necessity, a privilege, but also effectively something imposed. Like there is a bit this myth that French revolutionary armies were so enthusiastic. They actually did perform well, in part because there was still a backbone of French royal, ancien regime forces, but also because the spirit was high in general, like the average level of conscripts, right? That is true, but there were also lots of issues, and we will have to look at this because, of course, when you start, pouring all those, non-professional troops into the armies, you have to invent new ways of going. And we talked often about Napoleonic warfare. We talked about the Napoleonic art of war, especially from a tactical point of view. We observed this in thematic videos as much as in the von Kriege series that goes pretty much in detail at that point. Post, it was actually von Clausewitz was writing this over exactly the Napoleonic period, but also came to almost completion and fruition later, right? And was looking at the more mature model, of course, and that would be in fact the future, right? The sense that truly up to World War I, really the debate between the column and the line continued, even in a bit of an illusory sense, stemming from a bit the same hallucination that the concept of introduced by Jomini, for example. We're looking at, like, what's the best type of formation to win this specific engagement. Do it and you will win, right? Of course, von Clausewitz was rejecting this idea. Of course, was not rejecting the idea that, of course, there is a better formation you have to adopt in a given circumstance. But of course, there is a preeminence of moral forces, and it's not just by deploying in a certain way that will simply or necessarily make you win, because so much can happen that you can't even figure out or calculate or whatever. In any case, this innovation of the Napoleonic Wars, returning to denser and deeper formations, was obviously stemming from this masses now being injected in armies that were in fact capable of doing more with them. Some of you asked me a couple of weeks ago, like, or more, like, I've read that the French armies were, at least, no, it was something along the pattern of having had an argument on the internet with someone who told him that the French sucked during the Napoleonic era because they were conscripts. Yes, because the others, what were they? Why did they change their system exactly to introduce conscripts? Because France was steamrolling them, right? This is perhaps the greatest problem of all. I mean, the idea that collective training is intrinsically superior to individual capacity, and that civilization is solely based on that, because individuals fail, of course, is, pretty much the entire deal of the art of war, right? So there isn't anything, like, you can't, first of all, say to the grognard of 1805 that he's objectively not the greatest soldier in the world at the time. But there is also properly a theoretical issue, and I'm not surprised. I was interested in that question, which I wouldn't answer if not like en passant right now, because if reportedly, I'm not surprised that there are people who make still such arguments. I mean, we're in 2024. Right, a person with narrow cognitive functional capacities should not even come up with the idea anymore. Right, we're at a point in civilization, in the level of publishing, information accessibility, education, in which you should be able, as a mature human being, even a discriminant for that specifically, to understand why the opposite of what you're saying is true. Unfortunately, we're still at these levels. Like, I want to talk more about Napoleonic warfare, and still I realize that we need so much in terms of fundamentals to get straight, which is actually strange, because I've always found that linear tactics and Napoleonic warfare that was still based on that, are quite intuitive, right? It's the easiest kind of warfare to understand, right? But apparently there is a difference, of course, between what people think they understand and what they actually understand. And this is part of the story, at least when you hear, oh my god, but why did this, lines of battle proceeded under enemy fire? Why were they so compact together instead of scattering, just being under fire? You know that you need to make a video on the obvious that, however, may actually be missed, right? And on this, I don't insult, because I realize that we do live, after all, in contexts in which it's ever more difficult to find the reliable, even as far as the obvious is concerned, or maybe expressly on that. And so I think these videos are still preparatory. I have a Napoleonic warfare playlist that has been gaining steam and sort of volume, but mass more than else. But it's still the very beginning. We haven't started making like serious, heavy videos about Napoleonic warfare, which is also kind of strange, considering that, yeah, a bit like the Frankrieg series is a bit actually completing that void. But as far as the military historical, like Schwerpunkt, strictly meant work, has not delved into the only thing we did fairly well was at least the introduction to the Austerlitz campaign, the War of the Third Coalition. And that was very interesting, and it, I like doing it, so I hope we're gonna come back on something similar soon. As you know, I'm expanding into contemporary warfare, other than just the modern one, besides the more typically medieval and ancient ones. So today, I would like just to make a few points, as I've just started doing. Another chapter, for example, we'll have to touch is the one on the ordre mixte. There is this idea here and there, and in fact, among these mythologies, etc., of like, you say D column. Right? Again, I can't believe I'm explaining this, but I have to. It was sort of more or less preferential in certain armies rather than others, and there is the other concept of the French introducing this first, which is fairly correct. But you have to understand that aside from the battlefield reality that is very different from the manuals, that, as we have also commented on some occasions, being sometimes just saying literally the opposite of what the general would habitually do, it shouldn't be taken necessarily as, that's real. We touched on this also von Clausewitz, that is quite critical of the various authors that sort of began, especially in Prussia, to write during the 18th century. Stuff that was also good, but that, generally speaking, lacked still his personal genius, objectively. But as if, so you have to give this the real dimension in understanding how these kind of units really fought, right? And today we'll be saying things, I will not even start saying that, how we think the ordre mixte really worked, because it's even more complicated than the ABC of it. That seems a bit more complex. But the idea is, that, it's just like the idea that some countries had intensified, for example, the type of fire over to others, and that this would change so many things, or that would always be uniformly carried out. No, right? That's not how it happened. The main problem with the concept of the column and the line really stemmed in very, down-to-earth practice, and literally to the earth here. There, it's the distance, right? It was a matter of time, as always, like how much time you would have to effectively deploy in line. When you, of course, you came inside of the enemy, you had to take a particular position, and you literally didn't have well-trained enough troops to carry out that maneuver so that you could eventually arrive, say, in front of the enemy, deployed in the right way. This is also how, in fact, this is a problem for all formations, including the square, for example, that could be carried out in a very different set of situations, including, fleeing from the battlefield. Look at that Saxon regiment, I think, that was fleeing the field of Auerstedt, and that basically literally retreated in square. Like, that was feasible and successfully withdrawing the, say, screen, like getting rid of the enemy cavalry harassment. There are some episodes like even part of the assault of the Imperial Guard at Waterloo was carried out in that way. But speaking of the column, for example, there is MacDonald's episode at Bagram that wasn't definitely a great display. And in the video about the Grand Querelle, we also talked about certain, in that case it was a British officer talking about the obvious disadvantages of the column in especially closed space, like during sieges or whatever, that could even require, of course, like a column to pour into a breach or something like that, that in that sense, with well-placed artillery that you wouldn't necessarily have always, or having the lack of being rightly placed could create horrendous gaps, like making a strike, making dozens of people flying into pieces quite easily. Now, the ordre mixte, as you know, derived mostly from this French revolutionary issue that, as we said before, were the professionals of the Royal Army that would essentially have enough training to hold the line, that had, of course, that was the most successful formation. The 18th century worked in that direction, increasing firepower, and so deploying this with thinner formations and wider ones would be more difficult to outflank. But that had the intrinsic difficulty in that sense of maintaining the same alignment, especially also with other units, and that therefore had to proceed more slowly, and so taking more time to deploy effectively. And the ordre mixte consisted in essentially having enough time to. Some people misinterpreted that as if part of the. Now, I will not explain the organic, like the number of units involved, etc. But the idea of brigades, regiments can confuse you. Like, we'll have to be more specific in numbers, but The idea is that it would be, say, a center, like the line made of the usual thing, like 2-3 men essentially deep, tough guys, like the professional ones, and then the volunteers, so the conscripts. There are two different things, by the way. Placed on the flanks, but in column, right? So just with a narrower front covering the wings, basically, and having a much deeper formation. This is not how it worked, right? That was not the ordre mixte, because it, first of all, would actually increase the problems of alignment, as we were just said, like the conscripts were worse trained than the professionals. That column, just already framed in the first line, the contact with the enemy, would have still been unwieldy, because where do you put this, say, force, right? Where do you address it if you already deployed it in a battle line? But the ordre mixte actually consisted of, well, there were many ways, like that we know, like different manuals told how it could be carried out. There are also lots of problems in terms of actual deployability, considering what kind of roads, kind of terrain they had march on. So there are different philosophies, but the actual concept was that the infantry, the line infantry would hold, like the professionals would hold the main line. There would be some skirmishers, by the way. In some time we will make videos about Napoleonic line infantry and more, because we must really cover more Napoleonic warfare in all seriousness. And the conscript units would actually be deployed behind, right, the battle line at a certain distance, so that they could be used as a gradual fort, as reserves, to be, say, located in those parts of the line it was wavering, or just simply marching to somewhere, because that was the point of the column, that you would have to have also, in the best of a situation, some units in reserve that could quickly exploit, differently from the ones deployed in line, the tactical situation. Obviously, the line was never abandoned as the standard, say, the prevalent formation. And again, there were different ways also of deploying in line, for that matter, and you can have multiple lines as well. That is a tendency towards that, increasing depth, etc. So it would be really much more instructive to look at what the actual generals were, say, debating the topic like. But today we sail in a relatively more schematic way. The infantry, by the way, continued in all this to develop maximum firepower when in line. Right, gradually, again, there was better training, better weapons. These armies were becoming really more effective. And towards this last decade, of course, the same French Revolution proving that political sense that, say, the situation was mature in France to pass the first system. There was an increase in firepower, for example, among the British, that led among them to the habit, and by the way, ignoring the prescriptions of the same British manuals, of deploying the infantrymen in just two lines, right? And this was, again, in part connected with that greater aggressiveness in the sort of the quicker reloading time that apparently the British would insist on at this time in history, but we will see this in a bit of a more realistic sense, because again, armies fought in pretty similar ways. Like the doctrinal and technical depended on matters that were military, of course, but still as the product of particular political social balance, and of course the single contingencies. linear training, as we've seen, required intense, habituation, good psychological stability. It's not easy at this point. Of course, the main reason why these troops still fought all like compactly, close to next to one another, was the fact that simply the technology did not allow for a higher precision of fire, right? And the battlefield wouldn't become, say empty. This time still full for the introduction of the rifle so we are essentially at the end of the 60s and 70s of the 19th century, right? And still, like, it takes a bit of time, like, before the thing completely opens up. And still, the necessity of the line and the column continued, right? As we were saying before, as a doctrinal, theory in before World War I, and then of course some principles are still applicable, but of course warfare changes to the point that this initial like linear tactical tuitions are not quite of the same substance they had before. Now, finding themselves in their hands units made up of poorly trained recruits, the generals rediscovered the usefulness of massing them in large formations, which helped morale and better resisted physical impact. This was obviously a necessity, also from a psychological point of view. It is a matter of training. Training does that. We can keep these guys exactly the same weapons, but since they're conscripts now, they're not going to be as reliable as the professionally trained. And therefore, in order to boost their, not to make them break, because at the end of the day, that's the point, you would prefer to unmask them, to in fact use them, more as cheaper units in, at least in terms of individual, single soldier quality, and you could in fact employ them in more expendable roles as well, including in fact the ones of attack, right, that the column sort of invited to. And so this is very important, as you understand, during the Revolutionary Wars for the French initially, because of the actual like spurring techniques that they had, as we will see now, actually with many, some circumstances with disastrous results, because again, nobody had ever done this in history before. I mean, there had been, of course, the column and the line, something dating back to very old. It's a universal military principle, as we were pointing out, but the scale like of warfare, like in mass, that the Napoleonic times witnessed was really unprecedented, right? And the actual type of government that revolutionary France had was unprecedented. And it was unprecedented also for the enemies, that at the end of the day have to like initially exploit this moment of disorder, but the actual doctrine, the art of war, proceeds towards the confirmation of the use of this massed forces, right? And there is all a debate, even as far as Napoleon was concerned, saying, so from the time, this sense of discomfort that went in parallel with the revolutionary ideas and this new model and that rejected tradition, at least to that institutional extent, was bringing some military theorists to say, well, falsely, because of course it's not true, like Napoleon was playing in a sort of rougher, more disorderly, so kind of not unprofessional but clumsy way, right, just using this masses. Actually, he was mastering that warfare in a time which his opponents had to do the same, were not as good as that, and actually that type of warfare sort of entailed that clumsier proceeding compared to the more say, aristocratically sporty, smaller, and to an important degree professional forces that had been confronting each other during the 18th century. We have seen just recently, in part, this problem of the actual, say, thinness of the forces, like the French had, for example, at the beginning of the 18th century, a deeper formations, like 4 or 5 men even, against the 3 of the Dutch, of the British, in part for the same issues, in part for the fact that the army of Louis XIV had been a bit like a revolutionary army, right, back in the day, because nobody until that point in French history had the same type of armies that France had. Were much bigger and more, in fact, why? Because they were organized by a more concentrated power, right, that could afford to have a control even of this larger resources in interests of quantity, not just on the battlefield, but on the map of Europe. And so, is quality that important? Is technology that important even? Right, passing from the matchlock to the flintlock, not much. Like, and the French did well as well, right? And it took, like, in fact, also the improvements of the Allies to stand them, because that was the actual force involved. So actually, for the French Revolution, I mean, very, very easy here, very conceptual, very theoretical. Like, it was pretty much overall the same. We have already appreciated this aspect in many videos. We've seen how this had changed literally everything in terms of logistics. Like, these armies did not have supply trains. They didn't. Right? In the Napoleonic Wars, armies fundamentally, aside from something very technical, like unreplaceable, like war horses, artillery, they would simply live off the land, right? Just, you can argue, like, I don't know, the armies of the 30 Years' War. Why? Because they were so big that it wouldn't even make any sense to have this massive logistical train that had started developing, especially from the France of Louis XIV, to supply these bigger armies that, however, needed really to be supplied in order to move. And now armies were so big that they were better, like, just moving fast, and so this and consuming, like, the resources that would last just a couple of days, and that would have starved them to death essentially had this enormous masses remained concentrated there, and just moving. And that's why also Napoleonic warfare was so in scale, like, bigger, even on the ranges strategically, because of this, and the intrinsic force moved them being, in fact, that greater as a mass. And we could extend this to what we were saying before, that during the War of Spanish Succession, actually armies had gotten to the point of being actually in the hundreds of thousands, but for that time, at the beginning of the 18th century, in between you have here all the industrialization, etc., there weren't means to use them so orderly. Like, instead, it would actually happen at this point at the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 19th, right? That's how gradually you can appreciate that, because they had scientifically decided after the War of Spanish Succession to shrink the numbers to increase the quality. And that's how they had been toying with the same aspects of formations, of how, think about artillery increasing, power, new technologies being around. Armies become an ever more serious, bulkier thing, right? And resources are becoming sort of more totally, in fact, extractable, as we've seen also in our recent videos about the Code Napoleon and the state that in civil laws becomes at this point the only source of law, and has this truly absolutistic monopoly that no other, in fact, so-called improperly absolutistic government had in the previous centuries. But it's remarkable in the sense that, in fact, the French monarchy was the sort of more improperly absolutistic power of all, was actually, like all the other monarchies, actually proceeding towards the concentration of power to the point that this would, as the state, take over the same monarchy, right? And so that's also a bit the history of post 1815, because all other monarchies had eventually to fight with the same issue, and so the nationalism and socialism and that statalistic a movement, the constitutionalistic movement that was trying to change the system. And so we all know what happened also 100 years later. So it's a big deal, not just in a military, but also a political and moral sense, right, historically. So already in the last years of the Ancien Regime, the French military theory had been discussing the opportunity of introducing these deeper formations. Really find them since the mid 18th century. There's nothing really innovative, strange, new, or attributable to anyone in the Napoleonic era. Right? It was already a historical principle. We're talking about 6 or even 9 ranks deep, right? Which is again a lot, considering that again the standard was 2, 3 by this point. Linear tactics had previously been delving that direction. This tells you, even just mathematically speaking, how many people were involved more compared to before. Because of course here, like, the columns didn't mean that these French armies were getting just thinner at the front. This was proceeding, of course, in this pre-revolutionary times, was proceeding still was in a very theoretical way and just making some experiments depending on the tactical situation, whichever it was. And that, as we've seen, also to break the line can be a thing, because if you can have, yes, you can, of course, lack that width of front, but if you can break through an enemy unit in that way, if you have the force, as we've seen also how the Prussians had been thinking and practicing for a good while, the thing could work, right? The enemy did not have the capacity of outflanking you in the process, or gunning you in the center of the column, right? Like really smashing through bodies like crazy, like it could be done, right? Even if, of course, also in the French armies, linear tactics was dominant. And of course, these new formations were called, as they had always been called, columns. And they weren't even technically new. They were new by the different size that was being experimented now, unitly showing again that those resources were, let's say, there was essentially more energy to spend. To make a long story short, because and material in that sense as well, because otherwise this option would have not even been so hotly contemplated. There is theoretically a tendency to that sort of micro, theoretical, let's say, attempt in interest, if you want, in micromanaging. But because, of course, aside from the bigger actions, let's say even the smaller ones were starting to be important in scholarly, to given the difference of circumstances in this bigger mass, like they could be settled also with the use of the column as compared to the line. And so this is why in the regulations, in the manuals, it was being introduced, and also to a serious level of doctrinal effectiveness, the way it was translated also on the battlefield. So it was actually a very important thing, and influencing also Napoleonic warfare, and that's why we're actually talking about it in function of that. This is true for many intuitions, like many other reforms. Think about Guibert. There are many names that had been actually discussing these ideas. It's not just the idea of single persons, showing that systemically something was really already expanding in that direction. Now, the armies of the revolution instead were the first to regularly adopt these new principles. Other armies were quick to imitate them as well. It could have not been otherwise, particularly those composed of conscripts, such as the Prussian one, which had been actually one of the most conservative ones. In fact, as we said before, Frederick II's practice had been also for Napoleon, just that in a broader moral sense, admiration for the same military skills, but the actual theory, of course, too, for essentially most of Europe, the same French with the Guibert had sort of stepped ahead, and so it's interesting also how, of course, the Prussians were the ones who had to learn the hard way, not just a successful conscript army, but the very sap, right, of Scharnhorst and Clausewitz, say, level art of war, theory of the art of war, for essentially, in the highest sense that the board up to this day has ever witnessed. There hasn't been any other like qualitative improvement in military culture since von Clausewitz, in spite of what a lot of prima donnas want to make you sell with culturalistic nonsense, with books starting from, from Little Heart to Keegan and all these other. It's better if I don't qualify them, really. But people actually believe that. That's because, of course, they do not know anything about military history in general, even less about the art of war, or even, giving the definition of what this is. However, once the training manuals had digested and regulated this novelty, with deeper formations available and troops being trained to organize them, there is somebody who even attributed this change to Napoleon at the Battle of the Tagliamento River. This is not true, right? It was already, again, in the French military manuals, seriously, from the 50s, in the form it would sort of come to be, right? But in any case, there was this broader adaptation, like this intuition and this broader military cultural background, for which the commanders in the field, from the battalion commander level up, found themselves faced with practically but also theoretically, a previously unknown range of possibilities, right? And that's also why we really need to make a video, a more serious video about the line, the column, and the square as well. That, as you know, for anyone who has even a minimal understanding of what the Napoleonic era, not even from a military point of view, is like, knows how they work, as they should. And that could be employed, in fact, based on the circumstance of the combat dynamically. The commanders could choose each time, depending on the situation, whether to deploy their men in line or in more or less deep columns, because that changes well, depending really on whether they wanted to rely more on firepower or striking force. Because it's, again, also the imbalance that produces itself in the age of mass warfare, for which you don't have this tightly organized smaller armies that more or less maintain a higher degree of symmetry, not even at the time, as we've seen, that could be achieved. And actually the column had already been proposed exactly in those times and pretty early. In spite of the linear dominance, again, that was still an option, practically, even just for situations that produced themselves randomly. Just imagine if you increase the system by scale with mass armies that are sort of also much more dispersive in terms of energies, of forces, and can produce many more in sort of, say, more messed up situations, for which you could actually you would have actually even a greater chance, also in relative, not just in absolute terms, to use a column successfully. By the way, we're talking just infantry, as you understand, but there was much about this mass formations, as you know, being employed also by cavalry, right? Think about all the great cavalry charges in Napoleonic history, and how, in a sense, messy the whole thing really was. I mean, the idea of, say, artillery fire concentration in the center of the enemy formation, that in this sense was also deeper on average than it had been in the previous generations, and then launching cavalry en masse into it. And we're talking about thousands, like enormous clashes. Of course, it was messy, but it was also kind of the point, like concentrating mass in this after having adequately softened up the enemy in this combined armed fashion. It was much like it was also a matter of attrition, telling the truth, because armies became so large that, as you know, we've seen in von Clausewitz, they literally had a given time, clock time, before it was known that a division would be wiped out from the field. And so you literally had the time for, mathematically, certainly, for another unit to deploy. And this thing went on and on, like this struggle of forces. But in this sense, if you had looked at the smaller scale, of course, even if this seemed like just an attritionally almost immobile thing, the forces were so immense down the literal lines that that possibility of alternating was also greater. And this is kind of exciting if you think about that. And we all know the complexity, of course, of Napoleonic tactics compared also to the previous centuries. And this has to do also to the level of uniformation, standardization of the troops, that allows you to experiment more, because when that sort of flattens, yes, you are going, in terms of quality, and the same is true more or less also from the enemy side, because they're conscripts and they are more or less thrown in the same quality. You have a greater chance to practice like something that differs in terms of maneuver, mostly. It is true that, of course, the bigger the forces, the less options you have, but also that's why more glamorous masterpieces, as we've seen, like the one of Austerlitz, were pulled off. Like it, and that really highlights the genius of a commander like Napoleon, for that matter. So after infantry formations had evolved for 2 centuries, this is to sum up a bit like the thing, in historical perspective, aiming exclusively at optimizing a single parameter, firepower, many began to wonder whether it would have not been more innovative to focus everything in the sense of the bayonet charge, causing difficulties thanks to the speed and the impact force against the fragile and static linear formations. And of course, as we said before, it was largely an illusion, right? This does not mean that it was a country that was actually doing a thing or another, that these debates were just a collective hallucination. There was just the room in this wider war space to toy with ideas and also refining theories, as von Clausewitz brilliantly exemplifies, but also to get the actual deal, the concrete reality, of course, of linear tactics being prevalent. Yet, as we also already pointed out, the European militaries would continue to cultivate this myth of the column for another century, until World War I would swallow them into that bloodbath. And part of the reason is connected also with the essentially doctrinal, let's say, miscalculations before World War I. And let's again stress that actually all, say, World War I armies adapted in a matter of weeks to the new type, to that circumstantial type of warfare. 19th century generals had, of course, remained, stunned by the effect, the war of maneuver intended as that specific evasion from a type of warfare that was seeming, in fact, ever more attritional, at least by the scale that it had been during the Napoleonic Wars, and that actually the 19th century was a pretty violent century in many ways, also in Europe. But of course, it's not until World War I that sort of gets that full sort of perpetuated wrestling iron arm to that degree of mass. Again, there were very large wars in the 19th century between, say, in this 100 years, but they were sort of limited in scope, and so different from these two wars, right? So that in that case, maneuver had seemed to be sort of more attainable, and in spite of a type of warfare that was, again, already attritional, but not just simply like the Napoleonic War one was in open field, but also with, especially in the second half of the 19th century, an increase in that sense of also entrenchment, and that was starting to become evident again with rifled barrels, automatic weapons, like improvements, like in shelling, all this stuff, because the idea was like the genius, the great thing, is manifested in maneuver, right? Recently we talked about Germany during World War I, and some of you asked me about the so-called Schlieffen Plan, and there were multiple ones, as you know, and of course, you see at the beginning of World War I that necessity of maneuver, in spite of everything, in spite of the logistical difficulties, in spite of whatever they thought this outcome would be. Like, it is true that we're nobody to criticize them in those conditions, but there's also no way not to see that things went wrong compared to expectations, unlike which does happen, right? So it's about themselves, like in different times in history, but that is increasing the more you go on in the scale of warfare. Why? Because of what we just said, also from a tactical point of view. I mean, the bigger the system, the greater the chances, of course, that things are going to go differently from what you expected. It's a physical principle, right? So there are a bit of combinations that, and by the way, there had been military theorists even before World War I that had actually nailed it. They actually predicted how things would have gone. So it's not like that nobody would understand, or that it's also World War I generals did not know before the war broke out that things would actually go in that direction. Tangentially, they knew what a trench could do. They knew what machine guns now could do. But in many ways, warfare is also about these bigger factors, including starting from and even more so evidently mass warfare. That's why these tactical issues are, at the end of the day, are not so relevant as they seem. Because massive offensives in World War I were not just like one guy with a machine gun killing 30 enemies at a time. We're by the same scale of hundreds of thousands, right? And that in this sense is more like a moral reason, a political reason, right? Why, for example, I don't know, the Western Front didn't move but some kilometers for so long. And that must be understood not by mechanical but by material means, and that's of course an important realization also in Napoleonic warfare. That of course was much more mobile just by itself than it had been before, so those imbalances would actually produce themselves with the great Napoleonic victories and major also defeats by European scale, right? Because that's how, and there is a progression. Also, the 18th century had been a bit like that. I mean, in the 17th, there hadn't been a way to simply like, okay, well, now from France it will invade basically all of Europe, right? And so, nobody had the means to do so. This actually tells you what kind of enormous development the old continent had undergone. So there is this other factor, cavalry returning to rely on the bladed weapon more regularly since the second half of the 17th century. This actually was the amount of cavalry in that sense was already true since the end of the 16th century, as early as that. And in this case, this had proven effective. Of course, it was also in this sense kind of obvious. Nobody at this point was making dramatic doctrinal mistakes as the ones that, again, a bigger civilization would do later. And so there was a need to introduce also on a more standardized fashion the infantry square, right? Which, if you think about it, had not really been much of a thing in the previous art of war, right? You find literally everybody forming square at some point, especially when they have to defend against cavalry. But let's say in that small level of, say, tactical units, sometimes it can be also massive. The readiness, the training, the possibility of relying on yourself as well as on other arriving units, as we were saying before, new divisions of massive armies. Armies before were as deep as essentially the enemy, the single line, virtually, right? So once you had broken through that, was no point to make a square, unless you wanted to fight to the death, right? Whereas now, all those new opportunities offered you also the capacity of forming a square on a regular basis, being trained to do so, just to counter cavalry in a given moment. Naturally, that zeros movement, not completely, but still, like if you do so under the threat of a major charge, not like the Saxon battalions we were saying before, that was escaping from, in fact, the possibility of such concentrated forces arriving on him, is truly the only way to face cavalry, because it eliminates the traumatic moral effect of being surrounded, being outflanked, at least, that, especially for an infantry that is habituated, as we've seen, to fight prevalently in line, is a huge deal. There were ways to form square also from the column, of course, during the colonnade march, and there were old models that at some point we can look at in some depth, and different in shape depending on the prescriptions of the manuals. The square was still a formation that had no sides or shoulders, presenting in all directions several rows of men crowded shoulder to shoulder, capable of keeping the horses at a distance with the steel of their bayonets, even before the lead of the bows. This, of course, is like, actually, squares could be, would be charged into, like, historically, right? It's not like forming square was, okay, now just I'm safe from the same cavalry. Of course, the best way to form a square is to shoot a bit of beautiful mitraille into that, and or surrounding them with their infantry, and so concentrated fire into this or pretty crammed formation. After all, it very often is, as you understand, formed in mostly emergential situations, because being caught in the open, right, by cavalry with need of, that wasn't the decisive arm, because infantry was the decisive arm, so it means that you would have been exposed in so many other ways that obliged you to form square, was also carried out sometimes in clumsy ways, Right, were all specific ways of doing so, which also the same marching formations were measured to fit units in a particular depth. The squares did not even have to be necessarily, full squares. Like it could be just rectangles of some sort. But of course, the best way was not to offer like a broader front to smash in, preferentially at least. The idea is that, of course, a particularly worn-out infantry can be charged also by cavalry when it's formed in square. Historically speaking, and I say this for the sake of our medieval modern history, medieval ancient history content, but also the modern one, the infantry had always had squares formed at some point. Think about the skiltrons of the medieval Scots. Think about like all the the Flemish fighting to the death at Bouvines, or the Lombards prepared to do so around their Carroccio at Legnano or Cortenuova. The point was, of course, that at the time cavalry was stronger than infantry. So I say this because this was not the case in the Napoleonic times, but it also shows you how it's not about the formation. It's not about a specific level of technicality. It's about the actual strength of the formations, and that's the reason why, say, at the beginning of the 14th century, some infantrymen managed to defeat cavalry, just with the same weapons they had had before, but with greater toughness due to the desperate situation or particularly promising future in that direction. So it's always a political issue, but remember that this is real. This is how a reality really operates and how armies come to develop over time. I mean, the pike and shot era had been dominated by the square par excellence. In fact, before I said it was much of a thing in the sense that the square was not used, let's say, in it was employed as a standard formation by an infantry that was decisive over cavalry, and it would remain so, right? So actually, what you see in the 18th century is that cavalry is more important in relative terms to what it had been at the time of the square in the Renaissance era. And so that also shows you how the square in the Renaissance era, yes, had sort of been, of course, very effective against cavalry, but it hadn't precipitously been born and developed, especially, say, surpassing the Swiss model and attaching the shots to it for defending from cavalry that had been reduced just incidentally to a very poor thing in the process, right? So it was in fact about reaching the enemy line and smashing into it and attritioning in that kind of, and also because the shot did not have the capacity until, in fact, essentially the end of the 17th century to prevail. The end, it depends. Like as we've seen, the same bayonet in part had reintroduced, had this compensated for part of the necessity of having cold steel operating, also to stop the same cavalry, by the way. But it was a long way before, cavalry in that sense could have come back with the same prepotence on the battlefields, like you see, in fact, in the 18th, also in the 19th century. And as you see until actually also the beginning of World War I, in spite of the machine guns and all this stuff. So just think in this sense how dynamic warfare is and how there isn't really like the paper scissors rock thing. Yes, pike and shot warfare does look more like that because the fundamentals were harder in many ways, but even in the Renaissance, it's not quite all like that. Things were incredibly mixed. in particular also that the idea that cavalry was not much of a thing is a bit overly stressed, right? It wasn't really as tremendous as it seemed. Cavalry kept doing essentially the same thing it did before, right? Just it developed other functions that had already also appeared in times of the, say, the superiority of cavalry. So it's complex, but that's why you have to learn the history of the art of war, but step by step to refine a bit the let's say the measure, like, of the single factors, which is naturally that relevant, that important. There is, by the way, always so much to say about this. So just to finish on the importance of the mounted arm in the Napoleonic battles, the striking force of the cavalry was so feared that the square was used more and more often, not only when the infantry was stationary to defend a position, but also to move. Right, as we were noticing before, at Waterloo, the last assault of the Imperial Guard was led, even in this formation. And so there was something also psychological about the compactness of this formation, of the depth, especially of the infantry, that would help even going into that meat grinder. This is sort of a underestimated thing. I mean, as we were saying before, like, since the battlefields were full, like formations, battle lines were thick, and you had to gain the advantage essentially through it. It was really like a wrestling match after all. Yes, fought essentially more with musketry fire than the bayonet, but also, like, as independently from that, as a broader formation, giving you that sometimes moral cutting edge to smash into, like, also equally compact lines. And so it was a clash of wills, and that's also why the Clausewitzian theory always holds up so well, especially say, connecting it stereotypically to the Napoleonic era, that is, however, never make this mistake thinking otherwise. What von Clausewitz just describes for the sake of example, but while he's describing absolute strategic principles, right, that just in that time in history were declined like that, but as he also points out by referring to other times in history, of course, he knew perfectly well, being just like an example of how a specific strategic principle that is the thing that is interesting to define was declining in that particular time in history, not because there are different strategical principle, talking about strategy for what it is and war for what it is, because, say, in the 20th century, armies fought in a different way, in different ways actually. So it's the chameleon, as von Clausewitz points out, that war becomes, given the circumstances, not because, say, the chameleon genetics is altered in the process, you know. And so there is really so much to learn, and von Clausewitz is such a cut we can't avoid. Of course, also to go back, I realize we haven't been talking the Funkriege from a long time, and I realized it as well, but I'm trying to bring the channel to unparalleled heights before, administrating the rest of the Funkriege. I think we're at 3/4, even beyond. So we're a good point, but there is a lot of other Clausewitzian works, of course, that are worth discussing. So I don't know how useful these videos are, because I realize from your reactions that you tend to be very attracted to the Napoleonic era, and you're always gathering when I make a video on it, and it's probably in this sense disappointing, because these are so sort of broader, introductions to the Napoleonic art of war. It's not like really the ultra in-depth thing, whatever, but as I was saying in the beginning, from even some reactions, I feel the need to at least make these broader disclaimers almost, at least to get the fundamentals right, and have great plans for our Schwerpunkt, like the including the same Schwerpunkt, meaning that we never really talked about what Schwerpunkt is, its implications, how to make a strategic analysis. At least in part I talked about the latter aspect, but there's a specific Clausewitzian, not just Clausewitzian, just there's all a Prussian military history and a particular strategic thinking that we're skirting around, that I'm leaving for times in which we have really to take that bigger step. So just be aware that the more you share, the more subscriptions I get, and the more we are, the faster I'll accelerate in terms of actual stuff, right? So actual in-depth stuff as well. So let's really make this channel what was meant to be since the beginning, and I've been preparing for all this time just to take off in the proper sense that it deserves. I think it's very important for so many reasons that will be also clearer as we take these further steps. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.